Okay, good morning, Catholic Innovations. I'm sorry I can't be with you guys this Friday, but I can be with you digitally. So we're going to go through just a few notes on who C.S. Lewis was and why he matters before you start actually reading Mere Christianity, which you're going to do later today. So this handsome fella on the right is C.S. Lewis, Clive Staples Lewis, also known as Jack to his friends. He was born in Belfast, and we'll talk a little bit more about his background. And he's one of the most influential theologians, I would say. I read him probably a jillion times in theology classes at Notre Dame. So it's cool that you get to start reading him now in high school. So about his life, so you can see the timeline here. So he was born, like I said, in Belfast in Northern Ireland. His mom died when he was 10, and so shortly thereafter, when he was about 13, so a little younger than you, he decided that he was atheist. He rejected Christianity, even though he'd been born Christian and baptized Christian. When he was 19, he fought in World War I, and that was a really formative experience for him, experiencing war and the kinds of awful things that happen when you're on the front lines. Interestingly, so again, he rejected Christianity when he was like 13, and then by the time he was, doing my math, 30, so like 20 some years later, he decided that he wasn't atheist anymore. So the important distinction here is that he didn't suddenly become Christian, although that would have been cool too, but he just suddenly realized that there was a God. So in fact, his quote goes something like, "I finally gave in and admitted that God was God, and I was the most, reluctant convert in all of Christendom," is what he says. So he kind of went fighting, kicking and screaming, but couldn't reject the notion of God any longer because his intellect wouldn't allow him. He thought God was logical, and so he was like, I guess there's a God. 2 years later, he became Christian, and so he writes about this story. It's really funny. He was really, really good friends with J.R.R. Tolkien. So if you've ever read Lord of the Rings or watched Lord of the Rings, Tolkien is the Lord of the Rings guy. And him and C.S. Lewis were like besties. They hung out all the time. And Tolkien is Catholic, deeply, deeply Catholic. If you pay attention to the themes in Lord of the Rings, they're all really super duper Catholic. So anyways, he went for a bike ride with Tolkien, and he said when he left on the bike ride, he was not Christian. And by the time they finished the bike ride, he was Christian. So whatever Tolkien said during that biking trip really persuaded Lewis, and so he became a Christian. And then he spent the next 30-something years writing about Christianity and died in 1963, actually on the same day that John F. Kennedy passed away. So that's his life. A cool thing, so I mentioned he was besties with C.S. Lewis. In fact, Lewis, Tolkien, and then a bunch of other really influential writers of the time used to hang out at this pub. You can see the picture on the left, called the Eagle and Child. Super, super cool. They called themselves the Inklings, and they would get together once a week, and they would share what they were writing. So Lewis would walk into the pub and have, papers of his Chronicles of Narnia story, the one with the Aslan and the Pevensey children and going through the wardrobe. And he would read it out loud. And in fact, Tolkien didn't really like Narnia. He thought it was too simple. And then Tolkien would bring chapters from Lord of the Rings. So they would just share what they were writing, and they would talk about theology, and they would critique one another. So I think that's awesome. I wish I could have been a part of the Inklings. And you can still go visit the pub today if you're ever in Oxford, England. So next time you make a trip out there, go see it. Some important or just interesting quotes from Lewis that I think give you an idea of how he thought about his belief in Christianity. So he says, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." So for Lewis, Christianity was not compartmentalized in his life. It wasn't like he went to church on Sunday and then his beliefs didn't really influence the rest of his world. Like, Christianity was the lens that he looked through. It's how he saw everything in his life. So it's important to keep that in mind. Another great quote, he says, "Atheism turns out to be too simple." And remember, he was an atheist for 20-something years, so he does know what he's talking about. So he says, "If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning." So his point being that the fact that we can look around and say, like, oh, there's no meaning here, means that we feel like it should have meaning. And where does that feeling or desire for meaning come from, if not from God? It's kind of like a complicated logical deduction, like a geometry proof of how he gets to the existence of God. And he says, "I didn't go to religion to make me happy. I always knew a bottle of port, this type of alcohol, would do that. If you want a religion to make you feel really comfortable, I certainly don't recommend Christianity." I think a lot of times, I know people my age and people from your generation expect religion to make them feel kind of fuzzy and warm, like, God loves me, and that's the end of it, which is great. God does love you, I promise. But Christianity is also a challenging religion. It doesn't seek to make you happy, it seeks to make you holy. And Lewis was really good about recognizing that and seeing that suffering is going to be part of our life journey to God, no matter what. He also says, "Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important." So once again, Lewis here is reacting to Christians who are sort of lukewarm about their faith. Like, they go to church on Sunday and that's kind of it. And he says that's kind of silly, because if you really believe what you go to church for on Sundays, like, that's gotta impact your whole life. It can't just be something you do once a week. So either it's not true and therefore not important, or it is true and therefore the most important thing you could possibly ever do is focus on your faith and focus on God. So you might have read some of C.S. Lewis. So the one you probably have read or seen more likely than any others is the Chronicles of Narnia series. So some movies came out a few years ago, The Lion, the Witch, the Wardrobe, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. If you've ever seen any of those are all C.S. Lewis's children's books that are supposed to teach you about Jesus through Aslan, the lion pictured there. He also wrote a book called The Screwtape Letters that you're likely to come across at some point. So those are an imaginative work where he is writing a series of letters as though he is a devil trying to tempt a man into sin. So it's a devil giving another devil advice about how to corrupt this man and what tricks he can use to manipulate the man into sinning. It's really fascinating to read. It's hard to read because you have to imagine, you have to like flip everything he says. So Screwtape, the devil in the story, will say things like, oh, the enemy wants the man to be loving. Isn't that awful? And by enemy, he means God. And by loving being awful, he means he's a devil, and so he hates all things good. So everything you read in this book has to be flipped and reversed, but it's really interesting. And then the one we're going to read is Mere Christianity, which is maybe his most widely read. I can't really substantiate that claim. I feel like it's his most widely read book, but I could be wrong about that. So about Mere Christianity, which you're going to start reading today. So it was originally delivered as a series of radio talks. So you can actually YouTube this and find recordings of C.S. Lewis, speaking all of the chapters of Mere Christianity, because he delivered them on the radio during World War II. So he was an Oxford professor at the time, and the BBC asked him to make a case for Christianity live on the radio, and he delivered them, I think, once a week or once every other week, and people in England would tune in to hear him. So afterwards, they asked him to convert the transcripts of his radio talks into a book, which he does. So in the preface that you're going to read, he's going to explain how the talks came to be and how he transcribed them from oral presentations to the book you're about to read. So you today are going to read the preface, which we'll discuss when I'm back next week. The preface is kind of just setting the stage. So the book is called Mere Christianity because Lewis wants to argue merely for Christianity. So he's not arguing for any particular denomination. So he's not saying you should be Catholic or you should be Anglican, you should be Protestant, you should be Episcopalian. I could name you a bajillion denominations. He's saying eventually you should pick one of those denominations. They're all beautiful. They all have different things that are attractive about them, and you should choose one. You shouldn't forever just kind of be out in the open without a church to belong to. But he's saying his only goal in presenting his version of Mere Christianity is to convince you that you should be Christian and then let you make the choice of denomination from there. So throughout the book, he's going to say, like, oh, the denominations argue about this point, but we can all agree on that point. So it's really just about setting the foundational stage of, like, okay, what do we all agree on? And that's it. So Lewis is awesome. He is one of my favorite authors of all time, literally. And I think you're really going to like him, but I would warn you before you start on reading the preface today that it's challenging. You might need to reread certain sentences. You will need to take notes and annotate. You will probably have a lot of questions. That's great. Bring all of your questions to class next week. And I promise the book will start making sense as we work through it together. So, behave for the sub. I will see you guys when I get back. Have a great weekend.